And then this will be posted on YouTube later tonight or most likely tomorrow. All right. So 22 is helpful because this will actually set up with one of the types of problems that you'll see associated with the Hepburn protocol. So we'll get to that in just a moment. And then 23 is very similar to 22. And then 24 is a flow rate with some time elements. So you've actually already done 24 before, but let's look at these. So 22 says you have 1,000 milliliter IV that contains heparin, 25,000 units of heparin, and it's infusing at 1,000 units per hour. And they want you to convert that units per hour to milliliters per hour. So how do we do that? So there's two ways to do this. And I mean, there's probably more than that, but I'll just show you the way that I do it. Is basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from one flow rate, units per hour, to another flow rate, milliliters per hour. So essentially what they're asking you to do is take this and convert it to this. So units per hour, convert it to milliliters per hour. So my units per hour are 1,000 units per hour. But I don't want units per hour, I want milliliters per hour. So I need a way to get rid of units and give me milliliters. So I need to convert units to milliliters. Well, that's what the IV is for. You have 25,000 units of heparin inside that 1,000 milliliter IV bag. And so that's what we're going to use to convert units of heparin to milliliters of heparin. So 1,000 milliliters, 25,000 units. I'm going to cancel out units, and I'm going to be left with what I'm looking for, which is milliliters per hour. And then I'm going to take the 1,000 times 1,000 and then divide it by 25,000. And I'm going to get 40 milliliters per hour. Alternatively, you can switch this up where you can take, because you're looking for milliliters per hour, you can start with the 1,000 milliliters in the 25,000 units and then just multiply by the flow rate. Either way, you're going to get to the same answer. That won't change anything, but it is important to know that these two pieces of information, the 1,000 milliliter IV with the 25,000 units of heparin, they need to stay together. Okay. Just like the IV, you can't separate the heparin from the saline once it's in there. What is it? Yeah. The normal saline, once it's in there, they're all mixed together. So we just got to keep it together. Okay. But I'm going to advise you just to start with the units per hour. That way you have hour in the denominator, and just convert units to milliliters. And as long as you do it that way every single time with these types of questions, you should be good to go. And then we'll get some more practice when we get to the Hepburn protocol. So that was 22. So for 23, we're going to have a similar question, except now it's insulin instead of heparin, right? So it says 500 milliliters IV that has 500 units of insulin, and it's infusing at 10 units per hour. So I'm going to do the same strategy, 10 units per hour. I don't want units, I want milliliters. So I'm going to look at my IV, 500 milliliter IV that has 500 units of insulin. Thankfully, that cancels out for us, and the answer is 10 milliliters per hour. So obviously, these numbers will change. The infusion rate will change. So it might be 5 units per hour, and it might be, a 250 ml that has, 100 units. It can vary, but I've at least shown you how to kind of set up a question like this. The last one here, 24, I think is pretty straightforward. You've done this before where you calculate how much, how much time will this infuse at? And then they add in that it started at 8 a.m. on Monday. When would it end? So the first thing we have to do is we have to find out how long it's going to run for. So if it's 1,000 milliliters and it's infusing at 50 milliliters per hour, 1,000 divided by 50 tells me it's infusing for 20 hours. And you can answer that question. If you just did 1,000 divided by 50, it's the same thing I did, just writing it out differently is all. So if it started Monday at 8 a.m., what time will it stop? Well, one way you can do this is just say, okay, well, 24 hours from Monday at 8 a.m. would be Tuesday at 8 a.m. Take away 4 hours. You can say Tuesday, then at 4 a.m. is when it would stop. Okay. And then sometimes they'll want you to write like, 0800 as the start, and then 0400 is when it ended. That's, something you need to pay attention to depending on how your instructor wants it. I don't even know if you'll see this question on there, but it was something that was asked to be put on there. So you might see something that's similar. All right. Hepburn Protocol. The trick to the Hepburn Protocol really is just that you haven't seen it before, unless you've watched my videos. You really haven't seen it before, and so you don't really know what to do with the information. So the first thing you need to know is that everything that I have like surrounded in a border there is just a protocol. It's something that would be followed by the hospital or the clinic that's doing this Hepburn protocol. I'm trying to get the camera to stop pulsating, but I don't know how to do that. And we would then come up with, we're going to answer some questions based off of this protocol. Now, there's a couple things in this protocol that are important to know. A lot of times we're going to get the patient's weight in pounds. So the first thing is you got to convert that to kilograms. Okay. Step 2 of the protocol tells you that there is an IV of 250 milliliters, half normal saline. And in that IV is 25,000 units of heparin. You also know that there's a bolus dose strength of 1,000 units per milliliter. So this is like step 2 of the protocol is what you have available. Okay. There's some extra things in here that you just don't need to worry. You don't need to worry on the math part of this question. You don't need to fill in these things. They would be already filled in as part of the protocol at the clinic or the unit that's operating this protocol. So that's why I just kind of crossed them out. So step 2 is important. Step 10 is also important. Step 10 tells you what to start the patient on if they're going into the Hepburn protocol. Step 1 is to bolus them with 80 units per kilogram, and then to start them on a drip rate at 18 units per kilogram per hour. That information is also repeated at the top of where it says question 25, the protocol. Well, this is just part of the protocol. And in reality, this is the whole thing. Standard weight-based Hepburn protocol is all of this, okay? You'll use 11 through 15, but let's start off with what we need from questions, or for the first, to answer the first question, or question A and B, we only need to know part 10 and part 2 of the protocol. So what are the questions? So first of all, you'll notice that there are 4 questions here, A and B, and then C1 and C2. A and B, or when you get the actual test, you're only going to answer 2 of these. So you either answer only A and B or C1 and C2. You won't be answering all 4 questions. I gave you all 4 questions as practice for that purpose, just to practice doing them. But and then after we go through the protocol as is, I'll give you another scenario that's similar to the C1, C2, that is using a different patient weight and using a different patient, a different APTT time. So I'll show you that and what that looks like. All right, so let's go through the protocol so we can see what's going on here. And again, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to come back to it. All right, so patient's weight is 110 pounds. So step one is we need to convert the patient's weight in pounds to kilograms. So patient weighs 110 pounds. I'm going to convert that to kilograms by dividing by 2.2, and that equals 50 kilograms. So I think step one of how to answer this question or this problem is pretty straightforward. Question A says to calculate the number of milliliters to administer for the bolus. When I look at the protocol, step 10 says that we're going to do a bolus with 80 units per kilogram. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to account for the patient's weight, and I'm going to multiply by the 80 units per kilogram. When I do this, 50 times 80 will give me 4,000 units. Now, if the question said how many units to administer, we'd be done. If the question doesn't say that, the question says how many milliliters to administer for the bolus. So we have to come up to and look for how do we convert units to milliliters. So we're going to look at the step 2 of the protocol, and step 2 of the protocol gives me an IV solution, and then it gives me a bolus dosage strength. So I'm going to use the bolus dosage strength in order to calculate the milliliters. So you'll notice that the bolus dosage strength is 1,000 units per milliliter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert units to milliliters using the bolus dosage strength. For the Hepburn protocol, you're always going to do it this way. You're going to get the patient's weight, multiply it by 80, and then divide by 1,000. And that'll give you your bolus dosage strength in milliliters. Okay. And so when we do that math, it comes out to 4 milliliters. So the only thing I can change in this particular question is the patient's weight. So if they weighed 210 pounds, if they weighed 85 pounds, if they weighed 197 pounds, you just find that out what it is in kilograms, round to the nearest tenth, multiply by 80, divide by 1,000, and then that will be your quantity for the bolus dose. All right, so that's part A. Part B says, well, we need to we want to know what the milliliters per hour is. We want to know what the flow rate is. So it says calculate the infusion rate in milliliters per hour for the Hepburn IV drip. So I'm looking at this. I still have my patient that's 50 kilograms. We did the bolus already. The next thing is to start a drip at 18 units per kilogram per hour. So same patient, 50 kilograms. But now I'm going to multiply by 18 units per kilogram per hour. And that's just because I'm just doing what the protocol told me to do. Told me to bolus, told me to start a drip. $50 times 18 is 900 units per hour. Again, if they just said units per hour, we'd be done, but we want milliliters per hour. That's what brings us back to, remember we did question 22? Question 22, we had 1,000 units per hour, and then we wanted to convert it to milliliters per hour. And then I used the IV in order to convert units to milliliters. It's the same math. It's the same process, but we're going to use what we have available. we have available in step 2, heparin 25,000 units in 250 milliliters, half normal saline. What I would say is, and this is what's been helpful for me, is I always imagine the bolus, and this is probably not completely imaginary, it's probably exactly as it is, but the bolus dose strength is like, it's off to the side. We can use it as needed. We can put a syringe in there, pull out what we want, and then put it into the patient as a bolus dose. Okay. Whereas the IV, that's, you know, it's going right into their veins. It's right there. It's always, it's on. I mean, as long as it's on, it's dripping in. And so all we're going to do is change how quickly it's going in. We're either going to speed it up, slow it down, but we definitely got to get it started first for our patient who's at risk for throwing clots. So I'm going to convert units to milliliters. And then in step 2 of the protocol, it tells me 25,000 units, 250 milliliters. So I'm just following the protocol. As an aside, this ratio is the same thing as 1/100. So if you're looking for a shorthand, patient's weight in kilograms times 18, whatever that number is, divide by 100, and then you'll get the right answer. And then for this, it's 9 milliliters per hour. Any questions on getting the bolus dose or getting the initial infusion rate? All right, then let's look at the next section. In C part 1 and C part 2, we're basically doing the same thing, calculating a new bolus and calculating a new flow rate, but we have some new information. It says that after 6 hours, the patient has an APTT of 43 seconds. So we look at the protocol. So the protocol that's boxed in, steps 11 through 15, that's relative to after, you know, reevaluating their APTT. So if it's less than 35 seconds, we would follow this. If it's 36 to 44 seconds, we follow this. If it's 45 to 75 seconds, we follow this, and so on and so forth. So it says it's 43 seconds. That falls into the range of step 12, and it tells us to do something. It says to rebolus with 40 units per kilogram, and then to increase the rate by 2 units per kilogram. So we're going to do some new calculations. With this first question, it says calculate the number of milliliters to prepare. They're meaning how many milliliters for the bolus, the rebolus to prepare. And then the new infusion rate is in milliliters per hour. So that's pretty straightforward. So C part 1, same patient. This time it's 40 units per kilogram. Now, if you're like me and you're looking at this, say like, well, 80 is half of 40, and we know that it was 4 milliliters. The answer here should be 2 milliliters. You are going to be correct. Okay. But it's still helpful to kind of work through the process, because if you only get on your test C1 and C2, then you won't know this ahead of time. Okay. You won't know this initial because you won't have to have had calculated it in order to get it. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. So this would equal 2,000 units. We don't want units, we want milliliters. And so I'm going to use, because we're talking about a bolus, I'm going to use the bolus dose information, 1 milliliter, 1,000 units. And I'm going to get 2 milliliter for my bolus. So whenever I'm doing bolus, I use the bolus dose information. And whenever I use, when I'm doing a flow rate, I'm going to use the IV information. Okay. So again, where did I get that from? Step 2 of the protocol. you'll notice that if you follow along with me, I just ignore everything. Now, a lot of this is just because I've worked through this so many times, I know to ignore all these things. But as far as the math component, now, if you're doing this, if you're working on in a, cardiac unit or, you're working with post-surgery, hip, patients and things like that, please don't ignore the stuff. Okay. But for the math, I'm just showing you how to solve this math wise. See part 2. There's a little bit of a trick to this, because it says we're going to increase the rate by 2 units per kilogram per hour. So when it says to do that, we need to make sure we pay attention that what was the initial rate? The initial rate was 18 units per kilogram per hour. So if the initial rate was 18 and we're increasing by 2, 18 plus 2 would give me 20 units per kilogram per hour. And again, all I did was I took 18 from the original plus 2 is where I got 20 from. That equals 1,000 units per hour. And again, I don't want units per hour, I want milliliters per hour. So I'm going to use that information that's here, the 250 ml, 25,000 units. And you're going to get 10 milliliters per hour. Are there any questions on any of this?
So you said we're only answering 2 of them. Does the test pick which ones we're answering, or do we get to pick which ones we're answering?
The test will only ask 2 of those that are listed. So it'll either only ask you to answer A and B, and then, or it'll say A, B, but it'll be questions like this. It'll tell you an APTT, and then, but you're only going to do 1 bolus and then 1 flow rate.
Okay, so you just won't know which ones you're answering though.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you'll know when you see the test, but you won't know like, oh, I get to choose which ones to do. It'll just be based off of how it's asked. And I do believe the majority are just like A and B, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
So let me give you another scenario. So this would just be a made up version of this same question, same type of question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a different patient weight, and I'm going to give you a different APTT, and then we're going to calculate the bolus, and then we're going to calculate the new flow rate or drop rate, or it's not a drip rate, but the new flow rate for the heparin infusion. So let's say our patient is 128 pounds. Okay, so step 1 is we're going to go ahead and convert that to kilograms. So divide by 2.2, 128 divided by 2.2 is going to be, it says 58.1818181818. We're going to round that to 58.2 kilograms. Round to the nearest 10th. Rounding is usually fine for adults. When you deal with pediatrics, and you guys will have pediatric dosage calculations with Professor Kowalski this semester. And so the rounding rules will change a little bit with pediatrics because, obviously you're using a lighter quantity or smaller quantity, especially for the very little like pediatric, toddlers, infants, things like that. Obviously, if you're talking about like a 17-year-old, that's technically still pediatric, they could be like 300 pounds if they're like a big kid, right? So, but the metabolism and everything changes a little bit. And so you have safe ranges, but you're going to go over that. You'll even have a different dosage calc assessment for just pediatrics during your pediatric semester. And I did work through some of the pediatric stuff on my YouTube channel, so you're welcome to take a look at that if you get stuck, but I do think you get some good instruction on that. So, all right. So the scenario is this patient's already on a protocol. They've already started their heparin protocol. It's been 6 hours. We look at the APTT and we see that it's only at 28 seconds. Okay. So if the APTT is at 28 seconds, I'm going to look at the protocol and it says if it's less than 35, so that's where we're at, we're going to do two things. We're going to re-bolus with 80 units per kilogram, and then we're going to increase the rate by 4 units. So we are already on an infusion. We don't know what the current milliliters per hour are because we haven't we didn't do that calculation, but we can still figure it out because we can take 18, increase it by 4, and then we can still calculate and find out what the new milliliter per hour is. So step 1 is to calculate the new bolus or the rebolus. So I'm just going to do the same thing I did before, 80 units per kilogram. $58.2 times 80 is 4,656 units. We don't want units though, right? We want milliliters. So I'm going to still use the same bolus dosage strength because we're following the same protocol. And that bolus dosage strength is still 1,000 units per milliliter. So my answer is going to be 4.656 milliliters. And we're going to round that to 4.7 milliliters. Round to the nearest 10th. So notice that what I did, I multiplied whatever the patient's weight was, doesn't matter what it is, I multiply by 80, divide by 1,000. Okay, it's like clockwork. It's always the same when we're talking about bullet. And the only other option is 40 units per kilogram. So either multiplying for a bolus, you're either multiplying by 80 or you're multiplying by 40. And in both instances, you're dividing by 1,000. All right, now we need to calculate the new flow rate. So same patient, 58.2 kilograms. It says to increase the rate by 4. My initial was 18. So 18 plus 4 would be 22. So I'm going to take the patient's weight, 58.2, times 22. And I'm going to get 1,280.4 units per hour. I don't want units per hour, right? I want milliliters per hour, but I have a way to convert that. And I'm going to go back to step 2 of the protocol. So I'm in the protocol. I'm looking at step 2, heparin 25,000 units, 250 milliliters, half normal saline. So that's the same. That's what I'm going to use because that's what I'm using that's what I'm using for infusion. I use the bolus for the bolus and I use the IV for the infusion. So 250, 25,000. And I'm going to get 12.8, I believe. Yeah, 12.8 0.04 milliliters per hour. And then that's going to get rounded to the 12.8 milliliters per hour. Now, clinically, in reality, you may not be able to set the infusion pump to 12.8, but for the math bubble that we're kind of, practicing in, just know to go ahead and round to the nearest 10th when you get to this, unless you have an instructor that tells you otherwise. The only time you don't typically round to the nearest 10th is if we're doing drops, like drops per minute, because you can't give somebody a fraction of a drop. That would just be a smaller drop. So you can give them, like, if this were drops per minute, you'd say this was 13 drops. You would just round to the nearest whole drop, but you probably won't need to worry about that. I just letting you know just in case. So any questions on the Hepburn protocol?
Is that considered just one question, like if we miss it, or is it considered two questions?
Oh, good question. Yeah. So even though you're answering two things, like the bolus and the flow rate, if you miss them both, you missed 1 point. If you miss one, you missed 1 point. Yeah. And if you get them both right, obviously you get that point. So yeah, it counts as one. So you have 25 questions. If that happens to be the one you miss, which it won't be, you'll get 24 out of 25 and you'll still pass the test. Good question.